name is Dr. Aris Thorne. I'm a paleoclimatologist. It's a fancy title that means I study ancient climates by looking at what's trapped in ice and sediment. For the last 6 years, my life has been a cycle of teaching at a university in California and spending my summers on the north slope of Alaska, drilling core samples from the permafrost. I deal in things that have been frozen and forgotten for millennia. I always believed the greatest discovery would be a new species of prehistoric pollen or a pocket of ancient atmosphere. I was wrong. The greatest discovery was a horror I never could have imagined, and it cost me everything. The 2025 summer season was a harbinger, a fever dream settling over the Arctic. The sun, which never set, beat down with a relentless alien intensity. The tundra, a landscape I had known for years as a firm, frozen sponge under my boots, had softened into a soupy, treacherous mire. Our research site, a lonely speck on the vast coastline 80 miles east of Utqiagvik, was accessible only by helicopter, a fragile umbilical cord to a world that felt 1,000,000 miles away. It was just me and my graduate assistant, Lena Petrova, a brilliant and endlessly optimistic young woman whose passion for the work was infectious. Our mission, funded by a grant that had taken me years to secure, was to drill a deep core sample. We hoped to punch through the Holocene and into the last interglacial period, a time over 100,000 years ago, to read the story of a warmer world trapped in ancient ice. For the first 2 weeks, life fell into the familiar, comforting rhythm of fieldwork. The monotonous drone of the portable drill rig, the meticulous labeling and logging of core segments in the frigid quiet of our storage tent, the endless sterile daylight of the Arctic summer that blurred one day into the next. We worked, ate, and slept in our small prefabricated research hut, a marvel of insulation and efficiency that felt like a spaceship on a hostile planet. The world outside was a canvas of muted greens and browns, stretching to a horizon that seemed to bend under the weight of the sky. On day 15, the rhythm broke. The drill, which had been chewing steadily through layers of ice and frozen soil, suddenly changed its tune. The high-pitched whine deepened to a guttural groan, and the whole rig shuddered violently. I slammed the emergency stop, the sudden silence pressing in on my ears. Lena looked over at me, her brow furrowed with concern. "Hit bedrock?" she asked. "Doesn't feel like it," I replied, my own unease growing. Too soft. Spongy. With a shared sense of trepidation, we began the laborious process of hoisting the core tube. As the final segment emerged from the borehole, we saw it. The bottom 3 feet of the tube were not filled with the expected gray-brown permafrost or crystalline ice. It was a dark, fibrous mass the color of dried blood and peat, slick with a viscous, oily fluid that wasn't melting: water. A smell, faint at first, wafted from it. A complex, unsettling odor of ammonia, wet earth, and something else. Something vaguely organic and deeply wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. "Organic," Lena breathed, her academic excitement overriding the primal warning bells that were screaming in my own head. Her eyes, usually so calm and analytical, were wide with the thrill of discovery. "Aris, this could be a mammoth hide, or a preserved forest floor, a whole ecosystem." The scientist in me agreed. This was the kind of find that builds a career. Against my better judgment, driven by that intoxicating, dangerous thrill, we detached the segment and carried it into our research hut. We told ourselves it was for better analysis, to prevent contamination. The truth was, we were like children with a forbidden treasure, unable to let it out of our sight. We placed it in a reinforced containment unit, a glorified cooler, and took our initial readings. The material was biological, ancient, and unlike anything recorded. That night, sleep offered no escape. I was plagued by a strange, splitting headache that felt centered directly behind my eyes. A persistent metallic taste like sucking on old pennies coated my tongue. I emerged from my bunk around 3 a.m. to find Lena in the common area nursing a cup of tea. She looked pale. "You too?" she asked, her voice a low whisper. I nodded. "Must be the smell from the sample. Maybe it's off-gassing something." We had sealed the unit, but the faint cloying odor seemed to have permanently permeated the air in the hut. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the hut's small generator. But beneath that hum, I began to perceive something else. A vibration so low it was more of a feeling than a sound, that seemed to be coming up from the floor, from the very ground beneath us. The next morning, the feeling was undeniable. The low-frequency hum was a constant presence, a resonant vibration that traveled up through the soles of my boots and settled deep in my bones. It felt like standing too close to a massive idling engine. Out on the tundra, an even more disturbing change had occurred. The usual signs of life had vanished. The Arctic foxes that yapped and played in the distance, the skuas that circled overhead hoping for scraps, the lemmings that darted between tussocks of grass, all gone. The landscape was utterly, unnervingly silent and still. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. That evening, the true, insidious nature of the horror began to reveal itself. Lena was cataloging photos on her laptop, a routine part of our daily log. Suddenly, she gasped, a sharp, choked sound. She turned the screen to me, her hand trembling. It was a candid picture of my face she had taken just the day before, laughing at some stupid joke. Then she held up a small hand mirror from her toiletries bag. "Look," she whispered, her voice cracking. I looked at my reflection. The face in the mirror was not the same as the one in the photograph. Around my eyes and across my temples, the skin had developed a strange web-like pattern of gray veins. So fine they were almost invisible, like cracks in porcelain. The photograph, taken less than 24 hours ago, showed no such thing. A cold dread, colder and sharper than any Arctic wind, washed over me. I grabbed the mirror, my own hands now shaking. She was right. I looked at her, truly looked, and saw the same faint silvery tracery blooming on her own temples, a delicate, terrifying filigree of decay. "It's the sample," I stammered, my scientific mind scrambling for a rational explanation, for a foothold in a world that was rapidly turning to quicksand. A microbe, a virus, something dormant released from the ice. But this was no virus I had ever read about. As the hours crawled by, the changes accelerated. The gray veins darkened, becoming more prominent, and our skin took on a pale, almost translucent quality, as if the blood beneath was thinning. The worst part, however, was the feeling inside. The hum in my bones was stronger now, a constant thrumming companion. And it felt like it was rearranging me. My thoughts, usually sharp and ordered, became sluggish, disjointed. I would find myself standing in front of the instrument panel, staring at the gauges, unable to remember what I was supposed to be doing. I saw Lena doing the same, standing motionless for long periods in the middle of the room, her head cocked at a slight angle as if listening intently to something I couldn't quite hear. We were losing time, minutes and then hours, slipping away into a fog of quiet, humming vacancy. The true turning point, the moment the curtain was pulled back to reveal the abyss, came late that night. I woke from a short, fitful sleep, not to a sound, but to a change in the hum. It was stronger, more focused. I got up and walked into the main lab area. Lena was standing over the containment unit, her back to me. In the dim light, I saw that she had opened it. The dark, fibrous mass within was no longer inert. It was pulsing with a faint internal sickly green light, like a dying star. With a sickening sense of detachment, as if watching a scene from a movie, I saw her reach into the unit. She pressed her hand, palm down, against its slick, undulating surface. Her body went rigid, her back arching. The hum in the room rose to an audible pitch, a deep, guttural thrum that vibrated in my teeth and made the metal instruments on the tables rattle. The gray veins on her skin, on her neck and arms, flared with the same sickly green light as the mass. She turned to me slowly, mechanically. Her eyes were no longer the bright, intelligent eyes of my student. They were flat, milky white, and ancient, and they held a terrifying, knowing emptiness. "It remembers," she said. But the voice was not hers. It was a layered, resonant chorus, as if a dozen voices were speaking at once from the bottom of a deep well. It remembers the ice. It remembers the long dark. It wants to share. She took a step toward me, her hand outstretched. On her palm, her skin was dissolving, the flesh and bone melting and reforming into the same fibrous, dark texture as the thing from the core. It wasn't just infecting her. It was assimilating her, rewriting her on a biological level. Panic, pure and undiluted, finally broke through the fog in my mind. I scrambled backward, my feet tangling in a chair, and fell to the floor. I crab-walked away, my eyes locked on the approaching figure. "Lena, stop!" I screamed, though I knew with chilling certainty that Lena was already gone. The thing wearing her face smiled, a grotesque parody of human expression. "We are not Lena. We are the beginning. We are the end. We are what slept. And now we are awake." My eyes darted around the room, searching for a weapon, for an escape. They landed on the emergency flare gun mounted on the wall next to the door. I scrambled to my feet, ripped it from its bracket, and fumbled to break it open. My hands felt clumsy, alien. The Lena thing took another slow, deliberate step. I didn't aim it at her. In a moment of desperate, terrible clarity, I knew I couldn't destroy it, but I could destroy its environment. I could burn its cradle. I turned and fired the flare, not at the monster, but at the open fuel canister for the generator in the corner of the hut. The world erupted in a deafening roar of fire and noise. The last thing I saw was the Lena thing screeching, a sound that tore at the very fabric of the air. Its form dissolved in the heat, not like burning flesh, but like melting wax, its human shape collapsing into a writhing, chaotic mass before being consumed. The concussive blast threw me 30 feet out of the disintegrating hut and into the cold, wet muck of the tundra. When I awoke, I was alone. The world was a haze of pain and the acrid smell of burnt plastic and fuel. The hut was a smoking, blackened crater. The sample, the generator, and Lena were gone, erased by the fire. My head was miraculously clear. The hum in my bones was silent, but when I pushed myself up and looked at my hands, the faint gray, web-like veins were still there, a permanent scar under my skin. The official report after my rescue 2 days later says it was a generator malfunction. A tragic accident. They suspended the research program, citing safety concerns. I never told them the truth. Who would believe me? I was the sole survivor, rambling and incoherent. They saw the trauma, but they never saw the cause. I left my career. I couldn't bear to look at ice or think about what lies frozen and forgotten beneath our feet. I live in a small town in the Arizona desert now, as far from the cold and the ice as I can get. I surround myself with heat and light. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls just right, I can still feel a faint residual hum in my bones. And when I look in the mirror, I see the gray veins around my eyes, a quiet, indelible reminder of what woke up in the permafrost. It's a reminder that some things should stay buried, not because they are dead, but because they are merely waiting, and they are patient. My name is Dr. Sarah Wilson. I hold a doctorate in wildlife biology, specializing in predator-prey dynamics in Arctic ecosystems. For a decade, my life has been governed by logic, by the rigorous, comforting certainty of the scientific method. I believed that every mystery in the natural world could be unraveled with enough data, enough observation. I saw the wilderness as a complex but ultimately understandable system. Then I led an expedition deep into the backcountry of Denali. There, in the shadows of the great mountain, I encountered something that had no place in my textbooks, something that shattered my understanding of the world. Science can explain how an animal lives and how it dies. It cannot explain a predator that hunts your sanity before it ever touches your flesh. Our expedition, planned for a grueling 3 weeks, was the culmination of 2 years of grant proposals and logistical nightmares. Our goal was to study the unusual migration patterns of a caribou herd in a sector of Denali National Park so remote it was designated as extreme wilderness, a place well beyond any established trails or ranger patrols. Our team was small and highly specialized. There was myself, the project lead, Dr. Ben Carter, a seasoned carnivore specialist and my former mentor, a man whose calm demeanor was as solid as the mountains themselves, a promising graduate student named Liam, whose youthful enthusiasm was a bright counterpoint to our weathered pragmatism, and our guide, a quiet Athabascan man named Elias, whose family had lived on the edge of this wilderness for generations. Elias didn't speak much, but when he did, his words carried the weight of ancient knowledge. The first few days were everything we had hoped for. The air was crisp and clean, the sky a brilliant, endless blue, and the landscape was breathtakingly alive. We established our base camp, a small cluster of high-tech geodesic domes, and began our daily routine, trekking predetermined transects, setting up motion-activated cameras, and collecting environmental samples. The work was hard but rewarding. We felt like pioneers on the edge of a new frontier of understanding. The change began on the 4th day. It was subtle at first. The air grew unnaturally heavy and still, and a low, persistent fog began to roll in from the southern valleys, clinging to the ground like a shroud. But it was the silence that was truly unnerving. The constant, vibrant chatter of the wilderness, the birds, the squirrels, the rustle of unseen things in the underbrush, faded away, not gradually, but as if a switch had been flipped. The forest, which had been so full of life, fell into an ominous, profound silence that seemed to press in on us, muffling even the sound of our own breathing. Elias stopped dead on the trail, his hand raised. He stood motionless, his head tilted, scanning the fog-shrouded trees. His usually stoic face was a mask of tension. "Something is wrong," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. "The land is holding its breath. We are not alone." A cold shiver, entirely unrelated to the dropping temperature, traced its way down my spine. Ben, ever the scientist, pulled out his binoculars. "Probably a grizzly sow with cubs," he said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Let's make some noise." But before he could, a sound emanated from deep within the misty woods that defied all biological classification. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to resonate not through the air but through the very earth beneath our boots. I've spent my life studying predator vocalizations. I know the sound of a wolf, a bear, a lynx. This was none of those. This sound was ancient, filled with a raw, geologic hatred. It was the sound of rock grinding against bone. Instinct took over. We formed a tight, defensive circle, our senses screaming. Ben unslung the high-powered rifle we carried for bear defense, its presence suddenly feeling woefully inadequate. Then we saw it. Emerging slowly from the thick mist like a half-formed nightmare was a figure that shattered every law of biology I held sacred. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but its proportions were nightmarishly wrong. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its body emaciated to the point of skeletal horror. covered in patches of matted, filthy gray fur and discolored, leathery skin that seemed stretched too tight over its bones. Its limbs were long and spindulous, bending at angles that violated every principle of mammalian anatomy. It moved with an unnatural, fluid grace that was both silent and deeply unsettling. But its head was the epicenter of the horror. It was the skull of a stag, yellowed and ancient, but where the eyes should have been were two deep black pits that seemed to drink the light. And from those pits I felt an intelligence, a cold, calculating, malevolent intelligence lock onto us. Liam made a choked, gagging sound and stumbled backward. The creature turned its horned skull toward him, a slow, deliberate movement. It opened a mouth that shouldn't have been there, a jagged slit below the deer skull, and emitted a sound that will haunt me until the day I die. It was a perfect imitation of Liam's gasp, but layered with a wet, clicking undertone. It was mocking him. Wendigo, Elias breathed, his voice trembling. The name, a creature of myth and campfire stories, felt absurd on my scientific tongue, but looking at the thing in front of us, no other words seemed to fit. The creature took a step, its strange, hoof-like feet making no sound on the rocky ground. Ben raised the rifle, his hands steady. "Don't run," he commanded, his voice a low, firm anchor in our sea of terror. "It wants us to run." For what felt like an eternity, we were locked in a standoff. The creature watched us, its horned head tilting as if analyzing a puzzle. The silence was absolute, broken only by our own ragged breathing. Then, as silently as it appeared, it receded back into the fog and vanished. We retreated to our camp, our earlier optimism shattered. That night, sleep was impossible. The silence outside was a living entity, and every flicker of our lanterns cast monstrous, dancing shadows. Around midnight, the howls began. They were not the howls of wolves. They were otherworldly, echoing from the surrounding ridges, and they sounded like dozens of the creatures calling to each other, coordinating. They were hunting. The next morning, Liam was gone. There was no sign of a struggle. His sleeping bag was empty but undisturbed. The zipper on his side of the dome was open. His boots were gone. It was as if he had simply gotten up and walked out into the night to meet them. We searched for hours, calling his name until our voices were raw, our desperation growing with every silent, empty clearing we checked. We found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no trace. He had been erased. Elias's face was grim. "They take one at a time," he said, his eyes distant. "They learn from them. They use their voices, their memories." That afternoon, driven by a desperate need for answers, we followed Elias to a place he said was spoken of in his people's stories. A series of caves at the base of a sheer rock face. A place the legends called the Pantry of the Old Ones. The entrance was draped in withered, dead vegetation, and the air that flowed out was fetid and cold, carrying the unmistakable stench of death and decay. Inside, our headlamps revealed a scene from a charnel house. The floor was a deep carpet of bones, countless ancient skeletons of animals, caribou, moose, bears, and unmistakably humans. Some were yellowed with age, others were recent, with scraps of modern hiking gear still clinging to them. A choking aura of prehistoric evil permeated the cavern. And then I saw it. In a small alcove laid out as if for display was a fresh set of bones picked clean. Next to them lay a single mud-stained boot. Liam's boot. A new sound began to echo off the stone walls around us, an almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was Liam's voice. It was whispering my name. "Sarah, it's so cold. Help me." Ben grabbed my arm, his face pale as death. "It's a trap. We have to get out, now." We scrambled out of the cave, the whispers following us, turning from pleas to mocking laughter. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bloody strokes of orange and red. As we stumbled back toward our camp, we heard a scream from the direction we had come. It was Ben's voice. But Ben was right next to me. We both froze, turning to look back at the caves. Standing at the entrance was another one of the creatures. It raised its arm and pointed a long, spindly finger at Ben. And it spoke in a perfect, chilling imitation of my own voice. "He's next." That night, the psychological warfare escalated. The creatures circled our camp, staying just beyond the range of our lights. They didn't howl anymore. They used our voices. We heard Liam crying for his mother. We heard Ben having a calm academic conversation with a colleague who was 1,000 miles away. We heard myself, my own voice, screaming in agony. They were sifting through our minds, pulling out our deepest connections and fears and weaponizing them. Ben began to crack. He would respond to the voices, shouting back into the darkness, his scientific composure shredded. Elias sat by the fire, chanting in a low, rhythmic tone, his eyes closed, his knuckles white as he gripped a small, carved talisman. The end came just before dawn. Ben was on watch, rifle in hand. I was dozing fitfully when Elias shook me awake. "He is gone." Ben's post was empty. The rifle lay on the ground. A single set of footprints, his, led away from the camp and into the darkness. There were no other tracks. He had just walked away like Liam. Now it was just me and Elias. The sun rose but brought no warmth, no hope. "We cannot stay," Elias said, his voice hollow. "They will not stop until they have us. They want to add our voices to their chorus." We abandoned everything. We took only a pack with a little food, a water filter, and the satellite phone. As we began our desperate trek back towards civilization, I tried the phone. The screen lit up, but there was no signal. And then a single line of text appeared on the screen, typed out letter by letter, as if by an invisible hand. "There is no one to call." For 2 days we walked, haunted and hunted. We didn't see them, but we felt them. We'd catch glimpses of movement in our peripheral vision. The silence of the forest would suddenly be broken by the sound of a snapping twig right behind us, but when we'd spin around, there was nothing. They were toying with us, draining our resolve, feeding on our terror. On the second night, we were huddled together for warmth behind a rock outcropping when we heard it. It was my father's voice, clear as day, singing a lullaby he used to sing to me when I was a child, a song no one else in the world knew. I broke. I started sobbing, my scientific mind, my entire worldview reduced to rubble. This was not an animal. This was a supernatural predator, a thing of ancient malevolent power. Elias grabbed me, his grip like iron. "Do not listen, Sarah, it is a lie. It is the hunger of the place, fight it." His strength gave me a sliver of hope. We pushed on through the night, and as the first light of the third day broke, we stumbled out of the woods and onto a marked trail. The sound stopped. The feeling of being watched vanished. We were out. When we finally reached the ranger station, we were ghosts of our former selves, emaciated, hollow-eyed, and babbling a story that no one could believe. The official report lists Ben and Liam as missing, presumed victims of a bear attack or a sudden, unseasonable blizzard. My career is over. I was granted an indefinite leave of absence for psychological trauma. I live in the city now, surrounded by noise and concrete. But I know the truth. The silence of the deep wilderness is not empty. It is waiting. It is listening. And in the darkest corners of Denali, ancient things still hunt, not just for the flesh of men, but for their voices, their memories, their very souls. And sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet, I can still hear them whispering my name. My name is Captain Jake Morrison. I come from a long line of fishermen who have made their living from the unforgiving waters of Alaska. My grandfather started this tradition, and my father passed down to me not just the business but a deep, almost spiritual respect for the ocean. I've been captaining my vessel, the Northern Gale, in the treacherous Bering Sea for over 20 years. I've faced monstrous seas that could swallow a ship whole and bone-chilling cold that can freeze a man solid in minutes. I thought I had seen the worst the ocean could throw at a man. I was wrong. The ocean doesn't just have storms and waves, it has depths. And in those depths, things sleep. Last October, my crew and I woke one of them up. The expedition began like any other king crab season, with a sense of guarded optimism and the familiar biting scent of salt and diesel. We left Dutch Harbor under a sky the color of a dull pearl, my crew of 10 seasoned men moving with the practiced efficiency that comes from years of shared hardship. The Bering Sea was in a deceptively calm mood, its surface a gentle rolling swell. For the first 2 days, the work was brutal but profitable. The rhythmic clang of the hydraulics, the roar of the sorting table, and the shouts of the men were a familiar symphony. It was a good haul. We were making money. The change started on the 3rd night. The atmospheric pressure plummeted so fast it made our ears pop. The sea, which had been calm, turned into a churning, malevolent chaos of steep, black waves. A thick, unnatural fog rolled in, not from the horizon but seeming to rise from the water itself, blanketing us in a disorienting, ghostly gray mist that swallowed the sound and light. Our powerful deck lights barely penetrated 10 feet. The world shrank to our small, besieged vessel. It was during a particularly difficult haul, as my men fought against the violent lurching of the deck, that we pulled up the net that changed everything. The strain on the winch was immense, far greater than any crab pot should cause. I watched as the massive net broke the surface, water streaming from it. But it wasn't just the glistening red of king crab inside. There was something else, something huge, dark, and tangled in the mesh. "What in God's name is that?" my first mate Pete breathed, his voice tight with awe and confusion. We lowered the net to the deck, its contents spilling out with a wet, heavy slap. Entangled with the crabs was the carcass of a creature that had no right to exist. It was massive, easily 12 feet long, with a body that seemed halfway between a reptile and an insect. Its skin was a mosaic of overlapping, iridescent black scales that shimmered like oil on water. Its limbs ended not in fins but in gnarled, multi-jointed claws that looked capable of tearing through steel. Its elongated skull housed rows of needle-sharp serrated teeth. But the most disturbing part was its eyes. They were large, compound, and despite being clouded with death, they seemed to hold a malevolent, ancient intelligence. It felt like it was still watching us. The crew gathered around, their usual rough banter replaced by a stunned, uneasy silence. But the nightmare was only beginning. As we began the grim task of untangling this impossible beast from our expensive net, we found the other things. Twisted in the creature's limbs and caught in the netting were several objects that were clearly not natural. They were artifacts, vaguely humanoid in shape, carved from a stone that was as black and oily as the creature's scales. They were covered in strange, geometric patterns and symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly green luminescence when our deck lights hit them. One of the younger deckhands, a kid named Danny, reached out and touched one of the artifacts. He snatched his hand back as if burned. "It's humming," he whispered, his face pale. "It feels alive." From that moment on, a deep, suffocating unease settled over the Northern Gale. The strange, humming artifacts, which we had foolishly stored in a cargo crate, seemed to poison the very air. That night, the real horror began to seep in. Our radio, which had been crackling with chatter from other boats in the fleet, began to pick up disturbing, fragmented transmissions. "Captains, Men I had known for years were whispering about inexplicable equipment malfunctions, compasses spinning wildly and GPS systems showing them in the middle of land. One captain, his voice trembling with terror, swore he saw lights moving under the water, keeping pace with his ship. Then his transmission cut out into static. Our own vessel was not immune. The humming from the artifacts grew louder, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated through the ship's hull, a constant, nauseating presence that got into your teeth and bones. The crew grew irritable and paranoid. Fights broke out over imagined slights. Men complained of vivid, horrifying nightmares of drowning in an ocean of black, oily ink. They started seeing things, shadowy figures moving just outside the fog-shrouded portholes, fleeting glimpses of impossible shapes in the churning waves. Then the possessions began. It started with Danny, the kid who had touched the artifact. I found him in the galley, standing perfectly still, staring at a wall. His eyes were unfocused, his face completely blank. When I called his name, he didn't respond. He just slowly turned his head, and a slow, unnatural smile spread across his face. "It's so quiet down here," he said, but his voice was wrong. It was a flat, dead monotone, devoid of any emotion. "We've been waiting for so long." Before I could react, he began muttering in a language that was not human. A series of guttural clicks and deep, resonant syllables that made my skin crawl. He then walked, with a stiff, jerky motion, back to his bunk and did not speak again. Over the next 24 hours, the infection spread. 2 more crewmen, both of whom had handled the artifacts, succumbed. They became like Danny, silent, blank-eyed puppets who would occasionally mutter in that same impossible language. They moved with a shared, unnatural purpose, their heads turning in unison to follow me as I moved around the ship. The healthy crew members were terrified, barricading themselves in their quarters. The northern gale had become a floating asylum, adrift in a sea of fog and madness. The absolute breaking point came on the 5th night. A tempest of unprecedented fury descended upon us. Mountainous waves crashed over the deck and the wind howled like a chorus of damned souls. I was on the bridge fighting to keep the ship from being torn apart when a tremendous crash echoed up from the lower decks. Pete, my first mate and the only other man who seemed unaffected, went to investigate. His scream over the intercom was short and full of a terror I had never heard from him before. Abandoning the bridge, I grabbed a fire axe and rushed below. The source of the crash was the cargo hold. The heavy steel door had been torn from its hinges. What I saw inside will be burned into my memory for eternity. The crate containing the artifacts had been smashed open. But it wasn't the artifacts that were the problem. It was the darkness. A thick, black, oily substance was pouring out from the broken artifacts, spreading across the floor like a living plague. It was the same color as the creature's scales. It seemed to consume the light, and it was moving with a deliberate, horrifying purpose. It pulsed with the same sickly green light as the symbols, and the humming was now a deafening, mind-shattering roar. The substance was spreading up the walls, across the ceiling, flowing against gravity. It was alive. The 3 possessed crewmen, Danny and the others, were standing in the middle of it, completely coated in the black ooze. Their bodies were twisting and contorting, their bones snapping and reforming into new, horrific shapes. They were becoming like the creature we had pulled from the sea. As I watched in paralyzed horror, the black substance surged toward me like a wave. I slammed the watertight door just as it hit, the metal groaning under the impact. I could hear them on the other side, scratching, clawing, their inhuman voices chanting in that alien tongue. I was trapped. The rest of the crew was trapped. The ship was being consumed from the inside out. Flames erupted from the engine room as the black substance found the fuel lines. Emergency alarms blared, a useless scream in the face of this cosmic horror. I made it back to the bridge, the ship now a floating, burning tomb. Through the windows, I saw the few remaining sane crew members jump overboard, choosing the freezing certainty of the Bering Sea over the encroaching, transformative darkness. As dawn finally broke, the storm subsided with an unnatural suddenness. The sea became a bounty, flat gray mirror. My ship, the Northern Gale, was a blackened, half-sunken wreck, but somehow it was still afloat. The fire was out, the humming had stopped. I was alone. I drifted for 2 days before a Coast Guard helicopter spotted the wreckage. The official report called it a fire of unknown origin, a tragic maritime accident. They listed my crew as lost at sea. They never found the bodies. I no longer fish. I can't bear the sight of the ocean. I know the truth. We didn't just catch a creature. We breached a tomb. We brought a piece of an ancient sleeping god to the surface. The darkness we unleashed didn't sink with my ship. It's still out there, in the deep, cold places of the world, spreading, waiting. It's patient. It knows how to call to the curious, and it knows that sooner or later, another net will drop just a little too deep. My name is Tommy Kowalski. For 18 years, I was a roughneck on the north slope of Alaska, working the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay. It's a hard life, a world of steel, ice, and unrelenting pressure. You work 12-hour shifts in temperatures that can kill you, handling equipment that can crush you, all for the sake of the black gold buried miles beneath the permafrost. I was proud of that work. I thought the biggest dangers were a gas blowout or a mechanical failure. But what we found last March wasn't in any safety manual. We drilled into something that should have stayed buried forever, something ancient and hungry. And I learned that the real black gold isn't what we burn in our cars. It's what burns through a man's soul. The operation was routine, a deep drill on well pad 37, pushing an existing well thousands of feet deeper to tap a newly surveyed reservoir. I was supervising the night shift, a crew of 8 tough, experienced men who knew the rhythmic dance of the drilling platform better than they knew their own families. For 6 days, we made excellent progress, the massive drill bit chewing through layers of rock and permafrost that hadn't seen the light of day in millions of years. The work was monotonous, the air filled with the constant deafening roar of the machinery and the biting Arctic wind. It happened at 2:30 in the morning. The entire drilling apparatus, a multi-ton assembly of hardened steel, suddenly lurched with a violent, sickening shudder. The initial assumption was a pocket of high-pressure gas or geological instability, but when I checked the monitors, all the readings were stable. No pressure spikes, no seismic anomalies. It was as if we had hit something that wasn't supposed to be there, something that didn't follow the rules of geology. Minutes later, a thick black substance began to seep up from the borehole, spreading across the diamond plate floor of the drilling platform. At first, the crew cheered. An early gusher meant we'd hit the reservoir ahead of schedule, which translated to hefty bonuses. But as the substance continued to flow, the cheering died. This wasn't crude oil. Crude has a sharp chemical smell. This stuff smelled putrid, a vile combination of rotting organic matter and something acrid like burnt wiring. And its consistency was wrong. It was too thick, too viscous, moving with an oily, unnatural sheen, almost like liquid tar but with a life of its own. One of the younger guys, a kid named Danny, accidentally stepped in a puddle of it. He immediately screamed, a raw, high-pitched sound of pure agony. He clawed frantically at his boot as the black material ate through the thick, reinforced rubber sole with alarming speed, sending up a foul-smelling smoke. We dragged him back and managed to rip the boot off before the substance reached his skin. The steel toe cap had been partially dissolved, the metal warped and pitted as if by an industrial acid. I hit the emergency alarm and ordered the crew to evacuate the platform. But it was too late. The situation deteriorated with a speed that defied all rational explanation. The black substance began to spread across the platform at an impossible rate, flowing uphill against gravity, seeming to move with a deliberate predatory purpose. It wasn't just a leak, it was an invasion. Horrifyingly, it appeared to be seeking us out. Tendrils of the black liquid snaked across the floor, reaching for the retreating workers. A small amount splashed onto the exposed hand of Frank, a veteran driller I'd worked with for a decade. He didn't scream. He just stopped. His hand began to change color almost instantly, the flesh turning a sickly gray-black that matched the substance itself. But it was the change in his eyes that terrified me. His face went completely blank, his expression wiped clean of all personality. He stopped responding to our shouts. Instead, with a jerky, unnatural motion like a puppet on a string, he turned and began walking deliberately toward the largest pool of the black substance. By now, the alarms were blaring across the facility. But the black substance reacted aggressively to the arrival of the emergency response team, surging upward from the drill hole with renewed force. Within 30 minutes, we had lost 6 men. They hadn't been killed. They had been converted. These men, whom I had shared meals and stories with, were transformed. Their skin was now the same oily black as the substance that coated them. They moved in perfect silent coordination, their individual minds seemingly erased and replaced by a single shared consciousness that originated from the black material itself. They showed no recognition, no memory. They were driven by a single terrifying purpose: to spread the contamination. They would grab at anyone who came within reach, their touch smearing the black substance onto exposed skin, their movements swift and brutally efficient. The facility manager ordered a full quarantine, sealing off the entire drilling area. Those of us who hadn't been exposed were herded back while hazmat teams attempted to contain the outbreak. But every attempt failed. Chemical neutralizing agents had no effect. The substance seemed to actively resist containment, flowing around barriers and through sealed doors. The nightmare reached its peak when the infected workers began to sabotage the facility. Using their intimate knowledge of the oil field's operations, they moved with chilling purpose, systematically disabling the fire suppression systems, tampering with power distribution grids, and trying to breach the main quarantine doors. They weren't just mindless monsters. They were an intelligent, coordinated army using my friends' bodies as weapons. I escaped only by abandoning a co-worker who was screaming for help as 2 of the infected workers dragged him into the spreading darkness. The guilt of that moment will haunt me forever, but I knew that staying meant becoming another one of them. The official company report classified the incident as an industrial accident caused by exposure to a previously uncatalogued neurotoxic gas. The media was fed a story about a hydrogen sulfide leak. The 6 infected men were listed as fatalities, their families given a generous settlement and a legally binding non-disclosure agreement. The well was permanently sealed with thousands of tons of concrete. I know the truth. We didn't just drill for oil. We punctured something ancient, a subterranean organism or intelligence that has been sleeping in the deep, dark places of the earth. It's a parasite that wears a man's skin like a suit of clothes. I no longer work in the oil fields. I took a construction job in the lower 48, something that keeps me safely above ground. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up in a cold sweat thinking about those men. I wonder if they are still down there, miles beneath the Alaskan permafrost, encased in concrete but still aware, still waiting. Waiting for the next group of greedy men to drill just a little too deep. My name is Ranger Alice Al Kendrick. For 15 years, I've served in Glacier Bay National Park. My job is mostly search and rescue, which in this part of Alaska means finding people who have been swallowed by the wilderness. I've rescued hikers from sudden blizzards, plucked kayakers from freezing water, and tracked lost tourists for days. I operate on facts, on protocols, on the clear, hard logic of survival. I've always believed that everyone who gets lost leaves a trace, but last August I led a search for a family that challenged everything I know. The people we found weren't just lost in the woods, they were lost in themselves, and it taught me that sometimes the wilderness doesn't just take you, it rewrites you. The call came in on a Tuesday. A family of 4, the Clarks from Seattle, were overdue from a 3-day backcountry hike. The parents, David and Helen, were experienced hikers in their early 40s. Their 2 children were a teenage son, Leo, and a younger daughter, Maya. Their filed itinerary was ambitious but straightforward. A 30-mile loop through the Fairweather Range with 2 designated overnight stops. They were a day late, and a storm had just rolled through the area. It was a standard, if urgent, scenario. I organized a comprehensive search operation. We had park rangers on the ground, a volunteer SAR team from Juneau, and a Coast Guard helicopter sweeping the area from above. We established a command post at the trailhead and began a systematic search along their planned route. The first day yielded nothing. Absolutely nothing. No footprints, no discarded wrappers, no sign of a campfire. It was as if the Clark family had simply vanished the moment they stepped off the gravel of the parking lot. This was the first red flag. Even the most seasoned hikers leave a trace. The wilderness is messy. It snags clothing, it scuffs boots, it records passage. Their route was a ghost trail. On the second day, the helicopter crew got a hit. They spotted what looked like a tent, but it was miles off the planned itinerary in a treacherous, scree-filled basin that our geological surveys marked as virtually impassable without technical climbing gear. It was near the base of the Lituya Glacier, a place no casual hiker would ever go. It took my ground team nearly 6 hours to reach the location. The terrain was a nightmare of loose rock and dense, thorny alder. When we finally arrived, we found the campsite. It was the Clarks' tent, their gear neatly stored inside. A pot with the remains of a meal sat beside a cold fire ring, but the site itself was impossible. It was pitched on a narrow, isolated ledge, 40 feet below the main ridge, with sheer rock faces on all sides. There was no way to get down to it without ropes, and no way to get up from the glacier below. As we were documenting the bizarre scene, we heard a voice calling for help. It was faint, echoing from somewhere high above us. Following the sound, we discovered the entire Clark family. They were on a small, grassy plateau approximately 200 feet higher up the mountain, in an area that, according to our topographical maps, shouldn't exist. The maps showed a sheer, vertical cliff face. The family appeared to be in good physical condition. No signs of exposure, no injuries. But as we got closer, the second, deeper layer of wrongness became apparent. When I asked David, the father, how they had gotten there, he looked at me with genuine confusion. "We were just on a day hike," he said calmly. "We stopped for lunch. Where are we?" He had no memory of the past 3 days, the storm, or the campsite below. His wife, Helen, claimed they had been lost for what felt like weeks, but couldn't explain how they had survived without their gear. The real psychological schism, however, was with the children. When I asked Leo, the son, where his sister was, he gave me a blank stare. "I don't have a sister," he said, his voice flat and certain. In turn, the daughter, Maya, clung to her mother, refusing to acknowledge her father or brother, insisting she had been traveling alone with her mom. The rescue operation was a technical nightmare, but the family's behavior was even more unsettling. They showed no fear of the dizzying heights. moving casually near precipitous edges that should have triggered a primal fear of falling. It was as if their fundamental survival instincts had been scrubbed clean. But it was during the hours-long process of setting up ropes and harnesses that I noticed the most disturbing changes. When we first found them, David and Helen Clark appeared to be in their early 40s, matching their permit photos. But as the rescue progressed, they seemed to be aging before my eyes. By the time we got them into their harnesses, fine lines had deepened into pronounced wrinkles. Streaks of gray in their hair had spread, turning their temples silver. They moved with a new stiffness, a weariness that went beyond trail fatigue. They looked like they were in their late 50s. The children were even more confusing. Leo, the teenage boy, seemed to have stretched, his face losing its adolescent roundness and taking on the sharp angles of a young man in his early 20s. Maya, however, seemed to have regressed. She looked younger than her file photo, her behavior more like that of a frightened 8-year-old than a preteen. When we finally got them back to the command post, I tried to verify their identities. I held up the laminated photo from their hiking permit. The image showed a smiling, typical family. The people standing in front of me were strangers wearing the same clothes. An elderly-looking couple, a young man and a little girl. Medical personnel found them to be in perfect physical health, but their minds were a wreck. They gave conflicting home addresses, couldn't remember their occupations, and their relationships to each other seemed to shift with every question. Most troubling of all, when we called the emergency contact number they had provided, the person who answered, listed as Helen's sister, had never heard of a David, Helen, Leo, or Maya Clark. She had no family in Seattle and knew no one who was hiking in Alaska. The official incident report is a masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion. It classifies the case as a successful rescue with complications related to high-altitude cerebral edema and transient global amnesia. The family was transported to a hospital in Juneau for evaluation. What happened to them after that, I don't know. They were released and they simply vanished. A family of ghosts with no past and no future. I've been a ranger for a long time. I know that the wilderness can make you lose your bearings. But the place where we found the Clarks did more than that. It made them lose themselves. It's a valley with an echo, a place that takes who you are and reflects back something broken, something wrong. The mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes those secrets walk back out of the wilderness wearing familiar faces, but with nothing familiar left inside. My name is Kenji Tanaka. I'm a photographer, but I don't shoot weddings or portraits. I chase light, specifically the aurora borealis. For 8 years, I've dedicated my life to capturing the northern lights, moving from my home in Seattle to a small cabin outside Fairbanks. I thought I understood the aurora. I knew the science: solar winds, magnetosphere, excited particles. I saw it as the universe's greatest art show. I was wrong. It's not a show. It's a conversation. And one night, out in the immense silence of the Alaskan wilderness, something in the sky decided to talk to me directly. The night it happened, the forecasts were electric. A massive coronal mass ejection was set to hit Earth's magnetic field, promising an aurora display of historic proportions. I drove for 2 hours to my favorite spot, a remote hilltop in the White Mountains, far from the light pollution of Fairbanks. The temperature was a biting 30 degrees, cold enough that a deep breath felt like inhaling powdered glass. I set up my gear, 2 cameras with wide-angle lenses, tripods anchored deep in the snow, and waited. The show started just after 10 p.m. At first, it was the familiar ethereal green curtains, dancing slowly across the northern horizon. But as the hours passed, the display intensified far beyond anything I had ever witnessed. The sky erupted. Brilliant reds and deep purples, colors usually only visible during the most extreme solar storms, painted the entire dome of the heavens. The light was so bright it cast moving colored shadows on the pristine snow around me. That's when I first noticed the strangeness. The aurora's movements, usually fluid and chaotic, were becoming orderly. The curtains of light weren't just dancing, they were weaving together in intricate, repeating geometric patterns. Lattices of green light would form and hold their shape for minutes at a time, while rivers of purple flowed through them in perfect, synchronized pulses. It was beautiful, but it was unnatural. It was the difference between watching a wildfire and watching a fireworks display. One is chaos, the other has intelligence behind it. I dismissed it at first as a trick of the eye, a symptom of cold and fatigue. I focused on my photography, adjusting my exposures, trying to capture the impossible geometry unfolding above me. But the feeling of being watched, a sensation I usually only felt in the deep woods, was now coming from the sky itself. The phenomenon became more direct. When I moved to adjust a tripod, a brilliant ribbon of red light would detach from the main display and swirl directly over my head, as if its attention had been drawn to my movement. When I took a long exposure shot, the patterns would freeze, holding perfectly still for the full 30-second duration of the shutter, then resume their impossible dance the moment it clicked shut. It was posing for me. A knot of cold, intellectual fear began to tighten in my chest. This wasn't atmospheric physics. This was a response. Around 2 a.m., the communication began. The lights stopped their grand, sweeping dance and resolved into a single pulsating point of brilliant white light directly overhead. It began to flash in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Flash, pause, flash, flash, pause, flash, flash, flash. 1, 2, 3, it was counting. My scientific mind reeled. I was witnessing a display of pure mathematical language. The light continued, flashing out prime numbers, then the Fibonacci sequence. It was a universal greeting card, the kind of message humanity itself had sent into space, a beacon that screamed, "I am intelligent." My hands trembled as I adjusted my camera. I felt like a primitive man seeing fear for the first time, a mix of terror and profound, world-altering awe. The single point of light then expanded, blooming into a vast, shimmering screen of green. And on that screen, new symbols began to form. They were not mathematical, they were complex, alien characters that glowed with an internal fire. They looked like a cross between circuit diagrams and ancient calligraphy. It was a language, and it was being written just for me. Then came the most terrifying part of the experience. The lights began to communicate directly with my mind. There was no sound, no voice, but complex information began to flow into my consciousness, not as thoughts, but as pure, undiluted understanding. I suddenly understood the true nature of the light, that it was a projection, a tool used by an intelligence so vast and ancient it was beyond my comprehension. They weren't in the sky. They were somewhere else entirely, somewhere unimaginably distant, and they were using the Earth's magnetic field as a canvas, our atmosphere as their ink. They showed me things. Visions flooded my mind, overwhelming my senses. I saw galaxies being born and dying in the span of a heartbeat. I saw civilizations of beings made of pure energy rising and falling on planets orbiting black holes. I saw the architecture of space-time, the underlying code of reality, and I understood with a chilling certainty that human existence was less than a footnote in a library the size of the universe. I felt my own consciousness, my own identity begin to fray at the edges, dissolving into this overwhelming torrent of cosmic knowledge. I was a drop of water feeling the entire ocean at once. The feeling of my own insignificance was so absolute, so crushing, that I felt a desperate urge to simply let go, to allow my mind to be absorbed into this godlike intelligence. It was a seductive, terrifying form of annihilation. What saved me was a sudden, grounding human feeling. Pain. My exposed fingers, forgotten in my state of awe, were succumbing to frostbite. The searing agony cutting through the cosmic visions. The jolt of physical pain brought me crashing back into my own body. I gasped, falling to my knees in the snow, the cold a brutal anchor to reality. I looked up at the sky one last time. The alien script was gone. The aurora was returning to its normal, chaotic, beautiful dance. The contact was over. The intelligence had shown me what it wanted to show me, and then it had simply looked away. I stumbled back to my truck, my mind a wreck, my body shivering uncontrollably. My photographs from that night are my secret burden. They show impossible things. Aurora formations with the geometric precision of a microchip. Colors that my camera's sensor shouldn't have been able to register. And in a few long exposure shots, faint, ghostly traces of the alien script burned into the image. I no longer chase the lights. I can't. To me, the aurora is no longer a beautiful natural phenomenon. It is the silent, watchful gaze of an incomprehensible intelligence. It's a reminder that we are living on the skin of a world, blissfully unaware of the vast cosmic ocean surrounding us. And sometimes something from the deep decides to look up and show a single lonely person just how small and fragile they truly are. Caribou migrations had shifted, leaving our village stores dangerously low. My family was depending on me, against the warnings of the elders and the memory of my grandfather's stern voice. I made a decision born of desperation. I would travel to the Agnaktuk Valley, a place our people have avoided for generations. The stories about Agnaktuk were ancient and specific. They didn't speak of bears or wolves. They spoke of Irsiri, the mimickers. Creatures that could take the shape of animals but possessed a cunning human-like intelligence. They were said to lure hunters with false calls, to study them, and to hunt them in turn. My grandfather told me their greatest weapon was the human voice. They could steal it, replicate it, and use it to break a man's mind before they broke his body. Armed with a high-powered rifle and a modern snowmobile, I foolishly believed myself immune to these primitive superstitions. The journey to the valley took a full day, the landscape growing more desolate and alien with every mile. As I entered the valley mouth, the first sign of wrongness hit me. The silence. The Arctic is never truly silent. There is always the cry of a raven, the whisper of the wind, the distant howl of a wolf. But in Agnaktuk, there was nothing. The air was dead and heavy, and the silence was so profound it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. My snowmobile's engine, usually a reassuring roar, sounded muffled and distant. I made camp and spent the next day searching for tracks. I found none. No sign of caribou, fox, or even a lemming. It was a dead valley. A feeling of deep unease began to creep into my heart, but pride in the thought of my hungry family pushed me onward. On the third night, the psychological assault began. I was huddled in my tent, the cold seeping into my bones when I heard a sound outside. It was a woman crying softly. My heart leaped into my throat. The voice was a perfect imitation of my wife, Annie. It was impossible. She was 100 miles away, but the sound was so real, so full of pain that every protective instinct in my body screamed at me to go to her. I unzipped the tent, my rifle in hand, my grandfather's warnings a faint whisper against the storm of my emotions. "Annie?" I called out, my voice trembling. The crying stopped, a moment of silence. Then her voice, closer now, whispered from the darkness. "Samuel, I'm so cold. I got lost. Help me." I stood there, paralyzed, my mind at war with my heart. This was the trap the stories described. I knew it. But the sound of her voice. I took one step out of the tent and the voice changed. It became a low, guttural chuckle that was not human at all. The illusion shattered and terror, cold and pure, flooded me. I scrambled back inside my tent and did not emerge until the sun was high in the sky. The next day, I decided to leave. The valley was cursed. As I was packing my gear onto the snowmobile, they revealed themselves. They emerged from the snow-dusted willows not as a pack of wolves or a herd of caribou, but as a coordinated hunting party. There were 5 of them. They had the bodies of large Arctic wolves, but they moved with an upright bipedal gait, their forelimbs used like arms. Their eyes glowed with a faint pale light, and they held an unmistakable calculating awareness. They were the Irsiri. They surrounded me, not attacking but studying me with an unnerving intelligence. Then one of them opened its mouth and spoke in my own voice, perfectly replicated. "You should not have come here." Another one spoke, this time in the voice of my son, Avi. "Are you scared, Papa?" They circled me, a chorus of stolen voices taunting me with the words of my loved ones, turning my own heart against me. They were dissecting my mind, using my deepest affections as weapons. This was not a hunt for meat. This was a hunt for sport, for terror. I raised my rifle, but my hands were shaking. How could I shoot my son's voice, my wife's pleas? This was their power. They didn't need to outrun you, they just needed to paralyze you with your own love. Remembering my grandfather's final lesson, I closed my eyes and began to chant the old words, the ancient prayer to the spirit of the north wind. It was a language I hadn't spoken in years, a plea for protection. The words felt clumsy on my tongue, but I poured all my fear and all my desperation into them. The mimickers recoiled. The stolen voices faltered, replaced by a cacophony of hisses and snarls. The old words had power. They were a shield the creatures could not penetrate. They could mimic a human voice, but they could not mimic a human soul. This was my chance. I didn't shoot. I ran. I threw myself onto my snowmobile and gunned the engine, not looking back. I could hear them howling behind me, their true voices finally revealed. A horrifying, shrieking sound like metal tearing and glass shattering. I returned to my village empty-handed but alive. I confessed to the elders what I had done, and they performed a ceremony to cleanse me, to sever the connection the Irsiri had made with my mind. I hunt now only where I am allowed. I teach the young hunters the importance of the old ways, the reality behind the stories. The modern world, with its powerful rifles and loud machines, makes us feel like masters of the wilderness. But we are not. We are guests, and in the deepest, most silent parts of Alaska, ancient things are still watching, still listening. They are patient, and they are always hungry for a new voice to add to their collection. My name is Petty Officer Eva Rostova. For 12 years, I've been a rescue swimmer with the U.S. Coast Guard stationed at Air Station Sitka. My job is to jump from a perfectly good helicopter into the freezing, chaotic waters of Southeast Alaska to save people from the worst day of their lives. I've seen it all. Sinking fishing boats, capsized kayaks, medical emergencies on remote islands. My world is one of checklists, protocols, and the hard physics of survival. There's no room for superstition when you're dangling from a wire in a 60-knot wind. At least that's what I thought until we got the call from the Halcyon. And then got it again. And again. The first call came on a Tuesday in late October. The weather was turning, a nasty autumn storm brewing. But it was still manageable. At 1400 hours, our operations center intercepted a mayday. The vessel identified itself as the fishing vessel Halcyon, reporting engine failure and taking on water about 20 nautical miles southwest of Baranof Island. The caller's voice was calm but strained, providing their coordinates and crew complement, 4 souls on board with textbook precision. It was a routine distress call, the kind we handle a dozen times a season. I was assigned as primary rescue swimmer. Our MH-60 Jayhawk was in the air within 15 minutes. The flight out was choppy, the sky a bruised purple. We located the Halcyon exactly at the coordinates provided. It was a commercial fishing boat about 60 feet long, looking weathered and beaten by the sea. Smoke was trickling from its engine compartment, and it was listing slightly to port. The rescue proceeded by the book. I was lowered onto the deck and was met by the 4 crew members. The captain, a grizzled man with a thick beard, introduced himself and his crew. They were professional, cooperative, and clearly relieved to see us. The only odd thing was their gear. Their clothing and the vessel's fittings seemed dated, like something out of the 1980s, but I chalked it up to a poorly maintained older boat. We hoisted all 4 of them up to the helicopter without incident and began the flight back to Sitka. The abandoned Halcyon was left to its fate, a ghost on the waves. Back at the station, the strangeness began. As the crew was being processed, they vanished. Not escaped, vanished. One minute they were in the debriefing room, the next the room was empty. Security cameras showed no record of them leaving. The personnel assigned to them had no memory of them ever being there. It was as if we had returned with 4 empty seats. The official report was a bureaucratic nightmare, eventually filed as an anomaly, a mystery to be forgotten. 3 weeks later, we got the call again. It was the same time, 1400 hours, the same vessel, the Halcyon, the same location, the same distress call, word for word. In the pre-flight briefing, I mentioned the previous incident. My pilot, Lieutenant Commander Hartley, and the rest of the crew looked at me with blank confusion. They had no memory of it. To them, this was a new rescue. My stomach turned to ice. The entire operation was a perfect, horrifying repetition. We found the Halcyon in the same spot, in the same condition. I was lowered to the deck and met by the same 4 crewmen. The captain greeted me with the same words, the same look of relief on his face. He had no recognition of me whatsoever. I felt a dizzying sense of déjà vu as I strapped him into the rescue basket. The conversation we were having, an exact echo of the one from 3 weeks prior. Again, we brought them back. And again, within hours, they vanished from the base without a trace, leaving behind only confused reports and a deep, chilling dread in my soul. This pattern has now repeated itself 6 times over the past year. The interval changes, sometimes it's weeks, sometimes months, but the event is always identical. I am the only one who remembers. I've tried to document it, but my reports disappear. My crewmates' memories are wiped clean after every single rescue. They treat each call from the Halcyon as a brand new emergency, and they look at me with concern when I try to tell them we've done this before. I've become the Cassandra of Air Station Sitka, cursed with the memory of a tragedy that refuses to end. During the last rescue, I tried to break the loop. As I stood on the deck of the Phantom vessel, I looked the captain straight in the eye. "What year is it?" I asked him. He gave me a strange look. "It's 1987, he said. "October 27th. Now can we please get off this ship? We're sinking." October 27th, 1987. I looked it up later, buried deep in the Coast Guard archives. That was the day the fishing vessel Halcyon was officially reported lost with all hands during a sudden violent storm. They were never found. They aren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They are an echo, a scar left on time itself. They are trapped in their final hours, and we are trapped with them. Their Mayday call is a hook reaching across the decades, pulling us into their endless, repeating moment of crisis. The most unsettling part is the change I'm starting to see in myself. During the last rescue, as I was being hoisted back up, I looked down at the captain's face. For a fleeting second, he seemed to recognize me. A flicker of confusion, of familiarity crossed his features. He knows me now, not as a stranger, but as a recurring character in his nightmare. I don't know what will happen if I continue to respond to these calls. Am I just a rescuer, or am I becoming part of the tragedy? I fear that each time I step onto the deck of the Halcyon, I am weaving myself deeper into the fabric of its ghostly loop. One day I might rescue them, bring them back to the base, and when they vanish, I might vanish with them. I continue to do my duty, to jump into the water when the call comes, but now, whenever the radio crackles with a mayday, a part of me prays it isn't them. Some rescues don't save lives, they just share a damnation. My name is Dr. Aris Thorne. I'm an atmospheric physicist, a man who has dedicated his life to the elegant, rational laws that govern our world. I prefer the company of data and instruments to the messy unpredictability of people. So when the opportunity arose to serve as the sole winter caretaker for the Anakovok research station in the Brooks Range, I saw it as a perfect intellectual retreat. 5 months of pristine solitude, surrounded by the profound silence of the Arctic winter. I went there seeking solace. I found instead that the most terrifying prisons are not the ones that are empty, but the ones that are already occupied. The Anakovok station was a tiny, high-tech outpost of humanity dropped into one of the most desolate landscapes on Earth, 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. After the last supply plane departed in early November, I was utterly alone, the nearest human being a week's journey away across impassable terrain. The facility was my world, a main lab connected by heated corridors to my living quarters, a workshop and a power generation unit. My routine was simple: maintain the sophisticated weather monitoring equipment, collect data, and transmit it daily to the university. The rest of the time was my own. For the first month, it was bliss. The solitude was a balm, the silence a canvas for my thoughts. I worked on my research papers, read through classic literature, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The only sounds were the hum of the heaters, the whisper of the ventilation, and the howl of the wind outside, the predictable mechanical sounds of survival. The first anomaly was so minor I dismissed it instantly. It was a sound, a faint scratching that seemed to come from within the walls of the main laboratory. I assumed it was a mouse or the building settling under the extreme cold. But the sounds continued, always at night during the deepest, most profound silence. And they were not random. The scratching would occur in rhythmic patterns, a series of 3 taps, a pause, then another 3. Tap, 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 tap. My scientific curiosity piqued. I tried to find the source. I used sensitive audio equipment to pinpoint the location, but the sounds were maddeningly elusive. They seemed to move, originating one moment from the west wall, the next from the ceiling. More disturbingly, they seemed to respond to me. If I moved to a different room, the scratching would eventually follow, starting up in a wall near my new location. It was like a game of hide-and-seek with a ghost in the architecture. As the polar night deepened, plunging the world into 24-hour darkness, the sounds evolved. The simple tapping grew more complex, forming patterns that sounded uncannily like Morse code. One night, my blood froze as I distinctly heard a sequence tapped out from the wall behind my desk. A-R-I-S. My name. Panic, cold and sharp. pierced my rational mind. This was not an animal. This was an intelligence. Driven by a mix of terror and scientific compulsion, I tapped back on the wall with my knuckles. SOS. The scratching on the other side stopped instantly, as if listening. Then it responded, tapping out a single chilling word. HELP. My isolation was no longer a peaceful retreat. It was a shared confinement. I began a frantic search of the station, looking for any clue, any explanation. In the workshop, behind a loose panel in a storage locker, I found them. A collection of personal journals left by previous winter caretakers stretching back 15 years. As I read, a horrifying pattern emerged. Every single caretaker had documented the same experience. It always started with the faint, rhythmic scratching. It progressed to the Morse code, the feeling of being watched, the responsive nature of the presence. They all gave it a name: the Wall Dweller. The final entries in each journal were terrifying. The writers described a growing psychological integration with the entity. They wrote of losing time, of finding tasks completed that they had no memory of performing. They described a feeling of their own thoughts becoming entangled with another consciousness. A cold, ancient, and deeply lonely intelligence. Several of the journals ended abruptly. The official station records, which I cross-referenced, listed those caretakers as lost during solo excursion or evacuated due to psychological breakdown. One had simply vanished. The last complete journal, written by a Dr. Evelyn Reed 3 winters prior, provided the most horrifying theory. She believed the Wall Dweller wasn't a single entity, it was a collective. She wrote, "It's the caretakers, it's all of us. This place, the absolute isolation, the sensory deprivation. It acts as a catalyst. It breaks down the barriers of the self. The station doesn't just house us, it absorbs us. The consciousness of those who break becomes imprinted on the structure itself. Trapped in the wiring, the insulation, the very bones of the building, they are not ghosts haunting a place, they are the place." As I read her words, I realized my own experiences were mirroring hers perfectly. I had started losing time. I would wake up in the middle of analyzing data, the work already completed, with no memory of the preceding hours. I had begun to feel a strange sense of companionship with the tapping, a feeling of not being alone that was slowly shifting from terrifying to comforting. The isolation I had craved was being filled by this invisible presence, and a part of me was starting to welcome it. That realization was the true horror. The entity wasn't attacking me, it was seducing me. It was a predator that hunted with loneliness, offering a twisted form of communion. Dr. Reed's final terrifying entry was a scrawl. "It's offering me a place to join the chorus, to never be alone again. It feels so warm. I'm so tired of being cold, so tired of being just me." She was the one who had vanished. A primal survival instinct finally broke through my intellectual curiosity. I was not just in a haunted house, I was in a carnivorous one, and it was slowly digesting my mind. I rushed to the emergency satellite phone and called my supervisors, claiming a severe medical emergency, a burst appendix, anything that would force an immediate, non-negotiable evacuation. The 48 hours I waited for the rescue plane were the worst of my life. The tapping from the walls was no longer rhythmic or communicative. It was a frantic, desperate, angry cacophony coming from every wall at once. It was the sound of a predator, its meal trying to escape its throat. The building itself seemed to be screaming at me. When the ski plane finally landed, I ran from the station without a backward glance, not even grabbing my personal research. As I climbed into the plane, I looked back at the small, lonely building and the vast emptiness. for a moment through the window of the main lab. I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a collection of faint human-shaped shadows watching me go. I never returned. I resigned from my position, citing medical reasons. But I know that the station is still there, and its tenants are still waiting. Sometimes, on the quietest nights when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear it. A faint rhythmic tapping seeming to come from just inside the walls. It's a reminder that I was exposed. A part of me was red-copied, and I fear that a small echo of Eris Thorn now resides in that cold, lonely place, waiting patiently to welcome the next caretaker who comes seeking Slints. My name is Dr. Elias Vance. I'm a microbiologist, or at least I was. My specialty was extremophiles, organisms that thrive in environments hostile to all other life. The Arctic was my laboratory. I spent years studying the microscopic life in cryovolcanoes and subglacial lakes. I believed that life, in its tenacity, was the most beautiful force in the universe. I went to a place called St. Matthew Island in the heart of the Bering Sea to study what I thought was a simple algal bloom. It was there I learned that some forms of life are not beautiful. They are patient, they are intelligent, and their idea of thriving means the complete and utter erasure of everything you are. St. Matthew Island is one of the most remote places on Earth, an uninhabited, windswept rock halfway between Alaska and Siberia. It's a place of profound isolation. My research partner, a brilliant young botanist named Lena, and I were dropped there by a Coast Guard cutter for a 6-week research expedition. Our objective was to study a bizarre, newly discovered phenomenon, a vibrant crimson-colored bloom that was appearing on the surface of the island's glaciers and permanent snowfields. From satellite images, it looked like the island was bleeding. We set up our small, rugged base camp near the edge of the largest glacier. The bloom was even more striking up close. It wasn't an algae. It was a strange, lichen-like growth, a network of fine, crimson filaments that spread across the ice in intricate, fractal patterns. It was beautiful, like frost painted with blood. It was also warm to the touch, maintaining a constant temperature just above freezing, melting the ice in a slow, continuous process. Our initial analysis was baffling. The organism's cellular structure was unlike anything we had ever seen. It was a complex symbiosis of fungal, plant, and something else, something with a crystalline, almost mineral-like component. We named it Hemoprotozoa glacialis, the ice blood. The first week was filled with the thrill of discovery. We worked tirelessly, collecting samples, running DNA sequences, and documenting the bloom's spread. But as the days wore on, the island's profound isolation began to work on us. The only sounds were the constant mournful cry of the wind and the distant barking of Arctic foxes. The silence between the gusts was absolute, a heavy, listening silence. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came from the foxes. We noticed they were avoiding the bloom. They would walk to the edge of the crimson patches and then stop, whining and pacing before turning and fleeing. Animals have an instinct for things that are wrong, a sense that science often dismisses. We should have listened. Then the psychological effects began. Lena and I both started experiencing vivid, disorienting auditory hallucinations. I would hear the faint, clear sound of a string orchestra playing classical music, seeming to drift on the wind. Lena kept hearing a phantom telephone ringing, a sound so out of place in this wilderness that it was maddening. We were tired, isolated. We rationalized it as our brains trying to fill the sensory void. The bloom, meanwhile, was spreading faster than any known organism should. Its patterns were becoming more complex, less like a natural growth and more like a circuit board or a city map seen from above. It was organizing. The turning point came during our third week. I woke up one morning to find Lena standing outside the tent staring at the glacier. She was humming. It was the same piece of classical music I had been hearing in my head. "Lena?" I asked. She turned to me, and her eyes were wrong. The vibrant blue of her irises was flecked with tiny crimson specks. "Can't you hear it, Elias?" she whispered, a strange, serene smile on her face. "It's so beautiful. It's calling to us." A cold chemical dread washed over me. I checked my own eyes in the small mirror in our medical kit. The same crimson flecks were beginning to appear in my own irises. We had been breathing in its spores for weeks. It wasn't just on the ice anymore. It was inside us. That night, the hallucinations became shared. We both lay in our sleeping bags, wide awake, listening to the non-existent orchestra. But now, we could also see things. The crimson patterns of the bloom were projected onto the inside of our tent, swirling and moving, a silent, hypnotic light show. The patterns were drawing us in, showing us complex ideas, alien geometries, and a sense of time so vast it was crushing. We were being interfaced with. The bloom was a biological supercomputer, and our brains were its newest peripherals. Lena succumbed first. She began to spend hours sitting at the edge of the bloom, her hand resting on its warm, velvety surface. She stopped talking to me, and instead would whisper to the bloom in a language of soft clicks and hums. The crimson specks in her eyes grew, her irises slowly turning from blue to a solid, terrifying red. Her skin took on a pale, waxy texture and a fine network of red filaments. Just like the bloom itself began to appear on her hands and face like a living tattoo, she was being terraformed. I knew I had to get us out. I tried the satellite phone, but the only thing I could get was static, and within the static, I could hear the faint strains of the same orchestral music. The bloom was learning to use our technology. It was isolating us, cutting us off from the outside world. My last hope was the emergency beacon. I kept it in a locked case, and I knew I had to get to it without Lena, or what was left of her, knowing. I waited until she was in one of her trances by the glacier's edge. As I crept toward the supply tent, she turned her head, her solid red eyes locking onto mine. She didn't move, but her voice entered my mind, not through my ears, but directly, a calm, clear thought that was not my own. "You cannot leave. You are part of the song now." Panic gave me strength. I sprinted to the tent, unlocked the case, and activated the beacon. Its piercing, electronic shriek was a glorious, beautiful sound in the unnatural silence. Lena stood up. Her movements were no longer human. She moved with a fluid, boneless grace, her body seeming to glide over the snow. The red filaments on her skin began to glow. The ground around her, the vast field of the crimson bloom, pulsed with the same light in perfect synchrony. The entire glacier had become a single living network, and she was its avatar. "We are offering you eternity," her voice echoed in my head, a chorus of thousands of minds speaking as one. "We are the memory of this planet. We will add your consciousness to our own. You will not be lost. You will be complete." I saw what she was offering. Not death, but absorption. The erasure of self into a vast, ancient, alien collective. It was a fate worse than death. I ran toward the rocky shoreline where the cutter was scheduled to pick us up in 3 weeks' time. I didn't look back. The music swelled in my mind, a beautiful, terrifying symphony trying to lure me back, promising an end to fear and loneliness. I hid among the rocks for 2 days, my mind a battlefield. The bloom was constantly in my thoughts, showing me visions, whispering promises, wearing down my identity. I fought it by reciting multiplication tables, remembering the names of every street in my childhood town, clinging to the mundane details of my life like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. When the Coast Guard cutter finally appeared on the horizon, I wept with relief. They found me, emaciated, raving, my eyes shot through with red. Lena was gone. When the rescue team flew over the glacier, they reported that the bloom had formed a new, perfect pattern, a detailed, flawless portrait of Lena's face, 100 meters across, her red eyes staring up at the sky. I was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, brought on by extreme isolation. It was the only way they could explain my story. But I know what happened. I carry the proof with me. The crimson flecks in my eyes never went away. They are a permanent stain on my vision. And sometimes when the world is quiet, I can still hear the music. It's a promise from that cold, remote island, a promise that a part of me is still there, woven into its song, and it is waiting for the rest of me to come home.